Welcome back to our channel, Chess Enthusiasts. Today, we're delving into a legendary battle from the 1985 World Championship between two titans of the chess world, Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov. In this thrilling encounter, we'll explore the intricacies of the opening, as Kasparov kicks things off with a classic queen's pawn opening, transitioning into the rich and complex Nimzo-Indian defense. Join me as we break down each move, unravel the strategies involved, and uncover the brilliant tactics that led to Kasparov's victory in this historic match. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned player, this analysis will give you insights into high-level chess play. Let's dive into the game. Pawn to d4, Kasparov opens with the pawn to d4, controlling the center. Knight to f6, Karpov responds by developing his knight to f6, a common defense. Pawn to c4, Kasparov advances another pawn to c4, reinforcing his control of the center. Pawn to e6, Karpov prepares to support his center and develop his pieces with the pawn to e6. Knight to c3, Kasparov develops his knight, increasing control over the center. Bishop to b4, Karpov pins Kasparov's knight with his bishop, creating some tension. Knight to f3, Kasparov develops his knight, maintaining pressure in the center. Pawn to c5, Karpov strikes at the center with the pawn to c5. Pawn to g3, Kasparov prepares to fianchetto his bishop. Knight to e4, Karpov seizes the initiative by placing his knight in the center. Queen to d3, Kasparov centralizes his queen, eyeing important squares and intending to recapture on e4. Queen to a5, Karpov's queen targets the knight and the c4 pawn. Queen captures on e4, Kasparov decides to capture the knight and regain material. Bishop captures on c3, Karpov takes the knight, doubling Kasparov's pawns. Bishop to d2, Kasparov develops his bishop to d2, a strategic move that defends the knight on c3 and prepares to recapture if necessary. Bishop captures on d2, Karpov decides to exchange the bishop for Kasparov's knight, simplifying the position and removing a key defender. Knight captures on d2, Kasparov recaptures with the knight, maintaining strong control of the center and keeping his pawn structure intact. Queen to b6, Karpov develops his queen to b6, putting pressure on the knight on d2 and eyeing the b2 pawn. Pawn d takes c5, Kasparov captures the pawn on c5, immediately challenging Karpov's setup and further opening the center of the board. Queen captures on b2, Karpov responds by capturing the pawn on b2 with his queen, gaining material, and attacking Kasparov's rook on a1. Rook to b1, Kasparov plays his rook to b1, putting pressure on Karpov's queen, which is now under threat. Queen to c3, Karpov retreats his queen to c3, which is still active and maintains pressure on the knight on d2. Queen to d3, Kasparov centralizes his queen to d3, aligning it with the b5 pawn and preparing to recapture on c3 if necessary. Queen captures on d3, Karpov exchanges queens, simplifying the position further, which is characteristic of his style in similar situations. Pawn captures on d3, Kasparov recaptures with his pawn, strengthening his central control. Knight to a6, Karpov develops his knight to a6, preparing to reposition it toward the center of the board and potentially targeting the c7 pawn. Pawn to d4, Kasparov advances his pawn to d4, challenging Karpov's control of the center and freeing his pieces for development. Rook to b8, Karpov moves his rook to b8, placing it on the open file and preparing to support the b7 pawn and later the pawn advance. Bishop to g2, Kasparov develops his bishop to g2, fianchettoing it and reinforcing his control of the center and diagonal. King to e7, Karpov moves his king to e7, a common step in the endgame to bring the king closer to the center for support. King to e2, Kasparov follows suit by moving his king to e2, enhancing his position and preparing for future pawn advances. Rook to d8, Karpov brings his rook to d8, activating it and increasing the pressure in the center. Knight to e4, Kasparov maneuvers his knight to e4, centralizing it and preparing to apply pressure on Karpov's position. Pawn to b6, Karpov plays b6, potentially preparing to develop his light-squared bishop and solidify his pawn structure. Knight to d6, Kasparov advances his knight to d6, attacking Karpov's rook on c8 and showing the offensive potential of his knight. Knight to c7, Karpov moves his knight to c7, providing protection for the rook and preparing to reposition the knight to a more active square. Rook to b4, Kasparov shifts his rook to b4, increasing pressure on the b7 pawn and eyeing opportunities on the queen side. Knight captures on e8, Kasparov captures on e8 with his knight, forcing Karpov's king to recapture and capitalizing on the weakness. King captures on e8, Karpov recaptures the knight with his king, maintaining material balance but facing increased pressure from Kasparov. Rook to b1, Kasparov doubles down on the attack by placing his rook on b1, once again targeting the potential weaknesses in Karpov's position. Bishop to a6, Karpov develops his bishop to a6, looking to challenge Kasparov's rook and gain control of the board. King to e3, Kasparov centralizes his king, adding support to his advancing pawns and ready to convert his advantage. Pawn to d5, Karpov plays d5, looking to open the center and gain some breathing room for his pieces. Pawn c takes d6, Kasparov captures the pawn on d6, further activating his pieces and maintaining pressure. Rook to c8, Karpov brings his rook to c8, aligning it with Kasparov's advanced pawns. King to d3, Kasparov centralizes his king to d3, bringing it closer to the action and supporting his pawns for potential advances. Rook captures on d6, Karpov takes the opportunity to capture Kasparov's knight on d6 with his rook, gaining material but opening up the position further. Rook to a4, Kasparov moves his rook to a4, aiming to double rooks on the a-file and create pressure against Karpov's position. Pawn to b5, Karpov pushes his pawn to b5, looking to gain space on the queen side and prevent Kasparov from effectively mobilizing his pieces. Pawn captures on b5, Kasparov captures the pawn on b5, further structuring the queen side while maintaining active piece play. Rook to b8, Karpov shifts his rook to b8, now applying pressure to the b5 pawn. Rook to b4, Kasparov doubles his rook by moving it to b4, solidifying control over the b-file and preparing for future attempts to advance. Bishop to b7, Karpov develops his bishop to b7, supporting the b5 pawn and reinforcing the pawn structure. Bishop captures on b7, Kasparov decides to capture Karpov's bishop on b7, removing a crucial defender of the pawn and gaining more material. Rook captures on b7, Karpov recaptures on b7 with his rook, improving his piece activity while keeping the pressure on the board. Pawn to a4, Kasparov advances his pawn to a4, looking to establish a strong pawn majority on the queen side and prepare for future promotion. King to e7, Karpov brings his king to e7, centralizing it and preparing to support his pawns as the endgame approaches. Pawn to h4, Kasparov pushes his pawn to h4, creating potential for advancing his pawn structure and preparing to push for a kingside attack. Pawn to h6, Karpov responds by playing h6, preventing any potential threats from Kasparov's pawns on the king side. Pawn to f3, Kasparov solidifies his center by moving his pawn to f3, preparing to support his advanced pawns and control the e4 square. Rook to d5. Black activates the rook to d5, looking to counter white's pawn and exert influence in the center. Rook to c1. White moves the rook to c1, aiming to control the open file and prepare for potential attacks on the queen side. Rook to d7. Black positions the rook on d7, defending the d6 pawn and adding pressure on the d file. Pawn to a5. White advances the pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn and destabilize black's pawn structure. Pawn to g5. Black pushes the pawn to g5, seeking counterplay on the king side and trying to deflect white's offensive. Pawn takes g5. White captures the g5 pawn with h5, gaining material while keeping the momentum. Rook takes g5. Black recaptures the pawn with the rook, maintaining pressure on white's position. Pawn to g4. White advances the g4 pawn, looking to undermine black's pawn formation further. Pawn to h5. Black pushes the pawn to h5, attempting to create some space around their king. Pawn to b6. Garry pushes his pawn to b6, creating a passed pawn that poses a significant threat to Anatoly's position. Pawn captures on b6. Anatoly captures Garry's pawn with his pawn, but it only delays the inevitable as it takes away some control from his side. Pawn takes a6. Garry captures with his pawn, further solidifying his position and readying the pawn for promotion. Rook to b7. Anatoly moves his rook to b7, attempting to gain some activity and challenge Garry's pawn structure. Rook to c5. Garry moves his rook to c5, targeting the position of Anatoly's rook and increasing pressure on the c file. Pawn to f5. Anatoly pushes his pawn to f5, trying to create counterplay and open lines for his pieces. Pawn captures on h5. Garry captures the pawn on h5, furthering his material advantage and eliminating threats. Rook captures h5. King to c4. Garry moves his king to c4, getting closer to the action and supporting the advance of his pieces. Rook to h8. King to b5. Garry continues with his king, now advancing confidently as he prepares to finalize the win. Rook to 8. Anatoly places his rook on 8, trying to create a challenge as Garry's position improves. Rook to c4. Garry moves his rook to c4, positioning it for coordination with his king and passed pawns. At this point, Garry Kasparov, having a clear advantage in material and position, has effectively transitioned into a winning endgame. Anatoly Karpov resigns, acknowledging the inevitability of defeat. Thanks for joining us in this analysis of the classic game between Garry Kasparov and Anatoly Karpov from the 1985 World Championship. We've seen some incredible moves, strategic depth, and tactical brilliance that showcases why these two players are legends in the chess world. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to see more content like this, whether it's game analyses, opening strategies, or player profiles, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any updates. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Which move did you find most impressive? Do you have any suggestions for future games to analyze? Thanks for watching, and see you next time at the chessboard.